Since I posted my last video, I've had a few people ask me how I do these semi-rounded fret ends. Different people have different ways of doing them, but I thought I might very quickly give a sort of how-to for the way I do it, at least. So, the first thing I do is measure my fret fairly precisely. This is stainless wire, it's expensive, I don't want to waste any. And I tend to work from the back forward. I've done a few frets up here, but primarily I work from the back forward. And the reason is that these frets are wider. So if I cut a fret and after shaping it's a little too narrow, it's no disaster because I can just move it to a narrower slot and then go back and try this fret again. So it gives me a kind of safety margin, I guess. So what I do is I take my clippers and I take my wire and I bring my wire basically flush against the edge of the binding, and then I cut. So now I've got a piece of wire at the correct width, and it's time to undercut the fret, which means to remove this part of the tang. Now from here what I do is I need to undercut the tang. I do that with a file, but the problem is when you start out doing it, what happens is your fingers get really tired because you have to hold on to this thin piece of stainless steel. So I just take a little Dremel with a grinding wheel and I start off. That will give the file something to bite on and just make my life that little bit easier. So down we go. Now, that being done, we have a nice flat surface here. All I've got is a groove which is cut into this board. I actually got this technique from a guy called Sully. He's got a channel called Sully's Guitar Garage, and it's absolutely fantastic. If you haven't seen it, go check it out. It's a really good YouTube channel. Anyway, so I then put this in the groove and I work it down, and in its final position I'm filing flat against the wood and the tang is now gone and it's all completely flush. If you overfile, you'll create a divot, and that's something you really don't want to do. Okay, let's do the other side. Right, now let's put in the rough shape. I'm not sure how much you're going to be able to see of my technique, but I'll explain it before I do it. Basically, first I round the fret edges, then I sand in the curve. So now my fret is rounded and I'm going to sand across the top. So with the top sanded, the edges sanded, that's my base curve established. After we've got our rough shape done using the belt sanding table, what we do is simply fine up the shape, or firm up the shape. I've got a little groove here. I stick the fret into it and I simply file to get a nice curve. Couple of seconds, looking good. Then I flip it over and just give it one pass, and that takes off any burr which has developed here, which might stop the fret seating properly. And then I take a little bit of sandpaper. This is, I think, 600 grit, and I simply work downwards. If you work up and down, you'll rip holes in the sandpaper. So I simply work downwards and just sand that, polish it a little bit. Then the fret is checked, so this will be the 12th fret. We put it there, see that it's okay. Actually a tiny bit narrow now, so let's move it up and see how it goes as the 11th fret. As the 11th fret, it's perfect. So that's what we're going with. This is now the 11th fret. That means I'll put it in the spot here marked 11. After I've filled this up with all of the frets that I need, I then polish the ends of each fret. And it's very simple. To polish the fret ends, I use a bit of polishing compound on this wheel. At the end of that, we wind up with beautiful, rounded, highly polished fret ends. Then it's ready to go into the neck. Now with my frets all done, it's time for a new nut. So I get out a bone nut blank, and it just, I mean quite literally just fits in the space. So I'm not really going to be able to thin it at all. So let's just sit that in there. Okay. And now essentially I'll draw the nut on. Just mark the edges. And I'll also just roughly mark the shape of the top of the nut using a pencil angled across a fret. So let's cut this shape out and see where we go from there. Now notice that I have my safety glasses on and I'm using a stick instead of getting my fingers too close to the blade. Alright, now let's sand it. It's weird, something people really seem to object to is the smell of bone when you're making a new nut, but it's never bothered me at all. Maybe it's just because I grew up on a farm. And my favourite material is unbleached camel bone. I like the way it sounds, I like the way it works, and I like the way it looks. It looks kind of nice and vintage. Okay, so we've got our nut, it's shaped, it's got a little bevel on the back, it's been roughly rounded off, so we can just now sit that in. Wow, that looks really cool. It actually looks nice and vintage on this guitar. A brand new nut would just look kind of odd, I think. Okay, so now in a small vise I've got the original nut and I've got my new nut, and I'm going to cut some slots. For that, of course, I take out some fret files and let's put them in.